Amanda, did you get the two back in?
Yes, everyone should be back in, and we should be live streaming again.
Thank you. Back on the record, Mr. Maloney.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Perkins, there are very few offshore light sources in Ocean City, correct?
Yeah, I would disagree with that. That I have been there, I've observed a multitude of offshore light sources.
Well, would you agree that the effect of ambient light or other onshore or offshore light sources would be relatively minimal here?
No, I would not.
Do you agree that under clear weather conditions that the FAA obstruction warning lights would be visible from the Ocean City shore?
Yes.
To the extent that there are any other offshore lights that would not reduce the visibility of the Skipjack red lights, is it possible that they would distract, these would be distractions here as well?
I think that because something's visible doesn't necessarily mean that it would be a distraction, but it's likely to, under certain conditions, they are likely to draw the attention of certain viewers.
Did your opinion rely in any way upon the project having the aircraft detection lighting systems on their turbines, which have not yet been approved by the federal government?
We assume in our visual simulations that the lights were on, and therefore, regardless of the use of ADLS or aircraft lighting detection systems, the lights would be on anyway.
Did you also assume, as part of your opinion, that the red lights on the turbines would be blinking continuously?
That's correct. We assume that the lights would be flashing. However, the simulations only depict them in the on position.
And you would also agree that the blinking red lights on the turbines would in fact make the turbines more visible from the shore than how they are actually depicted in the simulations. Isn't that correct?
I think that the visibility of the lights would remain the same, but the blinking effect would be under clear conditions. The blinking effect would likely draw attention more so than if they were static.
Well, you didn't make any effort to create a visual simulation of what the blinking red lights would look like from the shore. Is that correct?
As I stated before, we presented them in the on position only.
Now, I want to ask you about GWP3. These simulations purport to show a panorama of 8 and 12 megawatt turbines. Isn't that correct?
I'd just like to catch up with you there. One moment. Exhibit GW2. I'm sorry, what were the exhibit numbers again?
Well, the exhibit, it's Skipjack 4, number GWP3.
So GWP3, I'm sorry, yes. So we both daytime and nighttime panoramas, that's correct.
All right, and did they show both 8 and 12 megawatt turbines?
Yes.
And you understand that now we're dealing with 12 megawatt turbines, correct?
That is my understanding.
And you would agree that if a panoramic simulation is not viewed from a particularly defined distance on a curved surface, that there could be a distortion of the view. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, are we still referring to the nighttime simulations? Because these are...
We're talking about the panoramic simulation that is GWP-3.
The panoramic simulation. So typically, think the most important thing with the
You're falling out. Oh, you're breaking up again, sir. Sorry. Breaking up.
let me try again. Yeah, there's a background noise happening that I think is cutting me off.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll try again. So the idea behind the panorama simulations is that there are specific viewing parameters. The curved display that you mentioned is the opinion of a few in the field of visual impact assessment. And the purpose of the curved panel is to provide a more comfortable viewing position in which it feels as though your peripheral vision is a part of that panorama.
You understand that there are those in the field that believe that that perspective is distorted because the curved surface distorts the view, correct?
Can you restate the question, please?
Sure. Do you understand that there is a body of thought in your field that the certain distances on the curved surface tend to distort the view of the viewer in a panoramic simulation, the purported view?
Yes, I think particularly in the past, panorama simulations have had a reputation of possibly distorting the way that the project appears in the panorama. However, in recent years, there's a body of evidence supporting that if the panoramas are photographed in a particular way and stitched in a particular way, that distortion can be minimized and in some cases completely eliminated from the panorama.
Well, and one of those distortions is that it tends to decrease the apparent size of objects that are situated far away from the center of the panorama. Isn't that correct?
In the panoramas presented in GWBP, that is not the case. The important thing with those is that they have to be printed at a larger size. So if you print a massive panorama field of view on a small, then yes, the apparent size of the project will be decreased. But these are meant to be printed in large format in order to gain a proper perspective of the wind turbine.
And that distortion, which reduces the size of objects far away from the center of the panorama, that's a dynamic well known within your profession, correct?
No, I think we're saying two different things. If you print a panorama small, the turbines will be small. The same goes for any regular simulation. But when we create our panoramas, we have the same foreshortening or distortion that occurs in the center of the image. And this is a relatively new product that wasn't previously available, I would say, in the last this product came around. And the way we present the simulations, that distortion that occurs near the center of the panorama is eliminated. And therefore, it remains an accurate representation of the project.
Well, the reason you use that elimination procedure is because the dynamic of distorting objects and making them smaller is well known in your profession, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And as a matter of common sense, in terms of all the recreations that we're doing here, let's take the panorama picture here that looks like it's 8.5 by 14 or 16 or 20. None of that can actually recreate what the wind turbines will look like from the beach or from a balcony of a condominium, because this is all reduced to an 8.5 by 20 piece of paper, correct?
The intended viewing size for those panoramas is 60 inches across.
All right, well, whether it's 60 inches or whatever, we're not really recreating what human beings actually see there any more than we're doing it on the photographs we saw earlier, where we're adding artificially light and darkness. What's printed on a piece of paper is just some model of some version, a simulation at a certain size of what it might look like shrunk to that paper, correct?
Well, again, we have specific viewing parameters for our simulations, and the scale representation of the turbines, if viewed properly, is an accurate representation of what you would see in the field.
Would you agree that the panorama you have here shows less detail than a single frame image would be taken with a longer focal length lens? Would you agree with that proposition?
Well, first of all, the panorama is actually taken with the same focal length as the previous photograph. The difference is the fact that it's multiple images stitched together. And I don't think, if as long as it's printed at the correct size and the viewing parameters are followed, it does not diminish the scale of the project.
Now, I want to ask you about overcast conditions. You used GWP4, the next photograph, to show, or at least purport to show 12 megawatt turbines during overcast conditions. You are not opining that under all overcast conditions, the project, the turbines would not be visible, are you?
I am not.
And it would depend upon all kinds of factors, including the degree of how much it was overcast, what the haze was, what the time of day was, where you're standing, and all kinds of other things. Isn't that correct?
Yes, there are a number of parameters that enter into any type of visibility offshore. I think the idea behind overcast conditions diminishing visibility is that it reduces the effective contrast of the turbines because they lack hard shadows that would exist under clear and sunny conditions.
And you would agree that there may be many days with overcast conditions where the 12 megawatt turbines would be clearly visible from Ocean City. Isn't that correct?
I would qualify clearly. I disagree with the statement that they would be visible. Under overcast conditions, the turbines could be visible, and under certain circumstances, they may be clearly visible. However, again, as I mentioned before, it's highly likely that under overcast conditions that the sun's rays are blocked by the cloud and moisture in the atmosphere, and therefore it diminishes the overall visibility of the individual turbines.
But there will be many days when the casual observer from the beach, without looking for the turbine, will be able to see them, correct?
Under clear conditions, yes, and occasionally under overcast conditions.
And how many you just don't know.
That's correct.
Now, let's talk about how much of the turbine is visible from the shore. You agree that under most conditions, the 12 megawatt turbines at 21.5 to 22.7 miles would be more visible than if you had 8 megawatt turbines at the same location, right? A matter of common sense, you agree with that. Is that correct?
If you're talking about the portion of the turbine that's visible above the horizon, yes. I agree. Yes, you would see more of the 12 megawatt turbine.
All right, and you agree that at 12 megawatt, that 82.38% of the nearest 12 megawatt turbine would be visible to the naked eye under typical viewing conditions from Ocean City.
I'm sorry, where is that number coming from?
Just doing the math on this, that We've already heard that 702 feet of the turbine would be visible. So if we did the math of that, that's 82% of the entire turbine.
I'm just going to check my notes or my testimony here to verify that that is correct. And I'm sorry, please state that percentage again.
Sure, I'll give you both of them. 82.3% of the nearest 12 megawatt turbine and 70.07% of the most distant 12 megawatt turbine. And you're referring that to GWP2 under appropriate viewing conditions. You reference it in your direct testimony at pages 4, 5, and 10.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Yes, I agree with the general terms regarding curvature of the Earth screening the turbines.
So if your math is correct, then that means the most distant of all the 12 megawatt turbines, 70% could be seen. That means 597.7 feet, almost 600 feet of the farthest turbine would be visible under appropriate normal viewing conditions. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And if 8 megawatt turbines had been used in the same distance, then 81.94% of the nearest 8 megawatt turbine would be visible. Isn't that correct?
The distances don't compare because the layout is slightly different, but under the 8 megawatt layout scenario, that percentage is.
All right. So not to spend too much time on this because we've addressed this, but unquestionably, the 12 megawatt turbines on a percentage basis would be much more noticeable from the shore than the 8 megawatt turbines, correct?
I disagree that they would be much more noticeable. And the main reason for that is, well, number one, you can clearly see in the simulations that the noticeability is very similar for both layouts, and the 12 megawatt occupies a smaller cone of view, or to say it a different way, it occupies a smaller portion of the horizon from this location in Ocean City. You know, I disagree that the 12 megawatt would be more noticeable.
Well, your testimony already is that only 66% of the most distant 8 megawatt turbine would be visible, which is only 446 feet, and that the closer ones, 81.4% would be visible. So we're talking about a couple hundred feet difference in terms of visibility. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, and at a distance that we're dealing with here, 19 plus miles and 21 plus miles, it's very difficult to notice that increased height. So noticeability does not necessarily directly correlate to the size of the turbine, particularly when you're dealing with issues where you know, the general width of the turbine tower, for example, only increases incrementally when viewed from such a great distance. I think that noticeability isn't affected by the choice of turbine size, with the caveat that because the 8 megawatt occupies a larger portion of the horizon, it will span a greater portion of the view.
I'm sorry, it will what, a greater portion of the view? It will.
Sorry, it will span a greater portion of the view.
Is your position that the 12 megawatt turbines at 21.5 miles out will occupy less of the horizon line than 15 8 megawatt turbines at 19.5 miles? Is that your position?
As stated in my direct testimony, yes, the cone of view would be substantially smaller when viewing the 12 megawatt turbine.
But that would not be true if it were viewed from locations south of the project, where the viewers would be looking at a row of larger turbines at an oblique angle. Isn't that correct? The angle is important here, right?
The angle is important. However, if we were from the Ocean City Pier, for example, which is further south from the location at 146th Street, which we've simulated, if you view it from further south, those numbers remain largely the same. They may go up or down by a degree or two, but substantially, and those cones of view would stay substantially the same, with the exception of possibly Assateague Island, which I have not run any calculations for the cone of view for Assateague Island.
And you agree from Assateague, because of its location, that it's possible that the horizon would be even longer than the perspective from the 8 megawatt turbines. Isn't that correct?
As I just stated, I don't know because I didn't do any calculations from Assateague Island.
But you agree, given the dynamic and the obliqueness of the view from that angle, that it's very possible, isn't it?
Again, I would defer comment on that, having not done any calculation.
Well, I'm not asking about calculations. You agree that there is some possibility that the horizon would appear greater for the 12 megawatt turbines because of the location of Assateague and the location of these turbines. Isn't that correct?
No, it's not correct. Again, sorry, I'll stop.
Sorry, Mr. Gunderson, was that an objection?
Yes, asked and answered, Your Honor.
Okay, yes, sustained.
Do you agree that the Skipjack project will be visible from the southern section of Ocean City on some clear days if the 12 megawatt turbines are located at 21.5 miles out?
So the turbines are 21.5 miles from the southern sections of Ocean City. However, with that qualifier, I agree that on some clear days, the turbines would be visible from that section of Ocean City.
Throughout your testimony, you've also used the phrase "more likely to be noticed." That is a subjective term, is it not? In your profession, there's no objective measurement of likelihood of notice, is there?
Other than, having viewed a multitude of these projects, does get a sense for noticeability. But beyond that, it is a fairly objective term.
It's a fairly objective or subjective?
Sorry, subjective term. I apologize.
And there's no objective measurements to likelihood of notice that you're aware of, correct?
No, there are visual impact assessment techniques by which noticeability can be measured to a certain degree. But generally speaking, it's the opinion of the viewer in most cases.
Now, the 12 megawatt turbines will have a U.S. Coast Guard marine navigation lighting, is that correct?
Mr. Maloney, For some reason, you keep breaking up, and you were like my best one before. So,
Well, I want to be your best one again. Whatever I was doing before, I'm going to try to do again.
yeah, because it is kind of breaking up. I'm surprised.
Let me try it again. How's that now? Is that better? I'm wondering if the battery's starting again. All right. Let me know if you have run into problems, and I'll.
Okay.
All right.
If you could repeat that last question.
Now,
Okay.
the 12 megawatt turbines will have a U.S. Coast Guard Marine navigation lighting system on it. Isn't that correct?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, they will.
And like the FAA lights, those lightings will be visible from the upper stories of the high-rise buildings in Ocean City. Isn't that correct?
That is a possibility, yes.
And those lights, like the FAA lights, will be continuously blinking. Isn't that correct?
I actually don't know the parameters for the Coast Guard lights. It depends on what sort of aid to navigation they get approved for, and I think that could potentially change the determination as to whether they're blinking or not. But that would be subject to check. I'm not an expert on turbine lighting.
And those lights will be a different color than the aerial hazard navigation lighting. Isn't that correct? Because they're for a different purpose. Correct?
Again, subject to check, but I believe that is the case, yes.
And those lights will not flash in synchronization with the aerial hazard navigation lights. In other words, the aerial hazard navigation lights will blink in one pattern, and the Marine Coast Guard lights will blink in another pattern. Isn't that correct?
I'm not confident that they in fact blink, so I can't answer the question. So,
Well, you're not familiar. Did you investigate any of these issues as part of your visual impact studies?
I did.
Well, so do you have any opinions as to the impact of the Coast Guard Marine navigation lighting?
Other than what you already stated, that there is a likelihood that under clear conditions from certain high-rise buildings, there's a possibility that you would see the Coast Guard lighting associated with the Skipjack project.
On a clear evening, it's highly likely that you'll see those Coast Guard lights that are going to be in the upper stories or the top of the and throughout the turbines. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, did you look at the impact of what's called cumulative nighttime impacts, the impact of the navigation lights, the impact of the aerial warning lights, the impact of whatever else might be seen at various times of early morning, late evening, to look at the cumulative impacts, either for daytime or for nighttime? All the potential impacts, the rotation of the blades, everything else.
We did investigate a number of scenarios from a number of locations along the Delmarva coast, and we included parameters for Coast Guard lighting, aerial hazard navigation lighting, during different times of day throughout each of those viewpoints.
You agree with the basic principle in your field that it's appropriate to look at the cumulative impact of various aspects of the presentation of the object, the lighting, the rotation of the blades, the location, everything else, to look at the overall visual presentation. You don't disagree with that school of thought, do you?
In the case of visual impact assessment, it's a common industry standard practice to investigate the project under different scenarios. The term cumulative is tripping me up a little bit, but we look at all aspects of the project. That is correct.
Mr. Maloney, approximately how many more minutes of questions do you have for this witness?
I think 45 to 50.
Okay, let's take a break at this point. Mr. Perkins, please don't have any conversations with your attorneys. We'll come back on the record at 3:25 p.m. Eastern. We'll go to around 5 o'clock today, and then we'll see where things stand. We're on recess till 3:25.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Timing was perfect.
Mr. Maloney?
Yeah, how am I doing?
I don't know what you did, how you fixed it, but you fixed it.
You know what I did? Don't tell the chairman this. I got the mayor to stop squeaking his chair.
I think it is my turn.
He's a squeaky chair guy.
You think this is it?
Did you ever know any mayors that were squeaky chair guys, Madam Reporter? Yeah.
Crazy.
Can you hear that right there?
You know whose chair this is?
Anytime,
Yes.
one of my questions,
One guy used to sit.
Madam Reporter, anytime you didn't like one of my questions, he squeaked his chair. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, because that really took care of the situation.
All right, I'm glad we did. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm gonna probably take up one because I think it's. All right, I'll go ahead and finish. There you go.
We'll start back up in about 30 seconds. Okay, we are going back on the record in case number 96-9. Mr. Maloney, you could continue your cross-examination.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Perkins, when we talk about cumulative impact, there's also the potential cumulative impact of the U.S. wind project to the south. Do you agree that if U.S. wind proceeds with its project in the southern leasehold area, that will add an additional cumulative impact to the Skipjack project, affecting overall views and visibility from Ocean City?
Your Honor, objection. We're here to talk about the Skipjack project, not the U.S. Wind project. So I object to this being outside the scope.
Sustained.
I'd like to be heard on this. When we're looking at the view impact, there is a doctrine, and our expert witness is going to talk about it, called cumulative impact, where the presence of some wind turbines in certain areas make it more likely that you will see and continue to direct your attention to others. He's acknowledged that this is part of the field. This is part of our experts' opinions. It is a major part of the visual impact analysis, and I think I'm entitled to ask him, number one, does he recognize in the field that this would be an aspect of it? Number two, did he look at it? It's in 2 pages of our expert testimony report.
Right, but did this witness testify to those questions in his direct or rebuttal testimony?
He has already told us that he has looked at some cumulative impacts, but he declined to put them into his report. And I'm just asking him, is this another one of those areas where he looked at it but didn't put it into his report?
I'm going to give you very little latitude here, but you could ask us 2 questions.
Your Honor, just to clarify, Mr. Perkins did not just testify that he considered cumulative impacts of other projects. He was talking about the Skipjack project and lighting, including impacts of lighting and turbines,
That's what
spin, et cetera.
I'm saying, the same thing.
Mr. Perkins is not testifying as to cumulative impacts of other projects. He's talking about the visual impact of this project.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Perkins. I can't see him on my screen right now. Mr. Perkins, in your previous testimony just a few minutes ago, with respect to cumulative impacts, were you discussing the impacts of solely the Skipjack project or other projects as well?
I was referring solely to the Skipjack project. That's why I had an objection to the term cumulative, because typically that's not used to describe a single project.
Okay, Mr. Maloney, this witness did not open the door for projects by other developers, so we'll have you make your case with your witness Sullivan, but not through this witness.
All right, thank you, Chairman. And with respect to Mr. Sullivan's opinions, and by the way, your rebuttal statement that you provided did not address Mr. Sullivan's statements about cumulative impact, correct?
I'm sorry, I don't know which statement you're referring to.
Your rebuttal statement. There's nothing anywhere in your rebuttal statement that addresses the 2 pages of Mr. Sullivan's testimony, direct testimony about cumulative impact, is there?
That's correct, because the subject of this proceeding is with regard to the Skipjack project.
So that's why you chose to not rebut that section of his testimony, is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you agree that the things that he addressed in those 2 pages are real and are a major aspect of visual impact? Do you agree with that?
Objection, Your Honor. It's outside the scope of Mr. Perkins' testimony.
I think he talked about visual, what he's included in his rebuttal or not. The fact that he failed to rebut that aspect of the testimony is significant. And I want to see if there's any basis in his field for not rebutting it, or is he just conceding it?
Well, we can stipulate that Mr. Perkins did not address that in his rebuttal testimony. The questioning is outside the scope of his testimony as a result.
The question now is, he did not address it because of a perceived legal reason not to, or did he not address it because it is not something that's recognized in the field? I'm entitled to have the record clarified about that.
I'll allow that question, and then we'll stop it there. And Mr. Maloney, your mic is beginning to get a little scratchy again. I'm not sure how you made it work, but it's sounds like we're going to be losing you soon.
You know what made it scratchy, Mr. Chairman? Every time the mayor didn't like one of my questions, he started squeaking his chair. So I'll ask the mayor to get another chair here.
Oh, I thought you got rid of him. He's gone. Okay. Well,
He's gone for the moment.
You could ask that single question, and then we move on from there.
Did you elect not to rebut the cumulative impact testimony of Mr. Sullivan about the cumulative visual impact of the U.S. wind project for any reason other than legal reasons? In other words, do you believe that it is not a recognized aspect in your field or proper subject of expert opinion?
I hate to say this, Mr. Maloney, but you're breaking up now. That wasn't real good.
How's that right now? Is that better?
Yeah, that does seem to be better.
All right, let me keep going. And if we have a plan B, if that doesn't work.
Okay, so I think maybe it would be best if you repeated that question.
Thank you.
To be
Did,
safe.
other than legal reasons, did you not rebut Mr. Sullivan's statements because you don't believe about cumulative impact of the U.S. wind project because you don't believe such analysis is supported in your field?
I think I answered this previously. The subject matter that we're addressing today is the change from the 8 megawatt to the 12 megawatt turbine Jack wind project only.
So your reasons were solely legal, is that correct?
Objection, it's mischaracterizes testimony and is asked and answered.
Well, let me put it this way. Do you agree that the NEPA, the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, requires an EIS to look at cumulative visual impacts? Do you agree with that?
Objection, Your Honor. Again, this is outside the scope of Mr. Gordon's Mr. Perkins' testimony.
I don't believe that this witness could possibly answer that question. He may, but I'm going to sustain the objection.
You testified on page 3 of your rebuttal that you generally agree with Mr. Sullivan's conclusions regarding the visibility of the Skipjack project using 12 megabyte turbines. And specifically, you testified on page 7 of the rebuttal, of your rebuttal, that there would be circumstances in which the turbines would be temporarily more visible than what is shown in the GWP-2 simulation you gave the commission. What would be examples when the turbines would be more visible than when it was shown in your GWP-2 simulations?
I think the simulation shown in GWP-2 is a regular reoccurring scenario that depicts high visibility of the turbines. And to answer your question, there are circumstances under which the turbines could momentarily be more visible. The first scenario that pops into my head would be something catamount to dark thunder clouds occurring offshore while the sun is still unobscured and shining on the turbines. Under a scenario like that, it's possible that the turbines could stand out more from areas.
And you stated in your rebuttal that dark clouds on the horizon are not a regular and repeated condition. How do you know that?
Well, I think having spent a great deal of time in Ocean City and Delaware and Delmarva shoreline, I'm constantly cognizant of things like that. And I did not observe a scenario like that. In fact, our view from 146th Street that is presented in my testimony, in my opinion, and based on my experience, is a high visibility scenario. In fact, the turbines contrast quite heavily with their background. So while we got close to a regular rear scenario, there could be situations where they would stand out more.
Well, and you're not holding yourself as an expert in how often dark clouds appear on the Ocean City horizon, are you?
It's something that would require, the answer to that is no, but it's something that...
You're not a meteorologist or something similar.
I am not. However, I do frequently review weather conditions. I think even meteorologist would have a difficult time predicting that sort of scenario. It would have to be based on, constellation of the coastline.
And when you say in your testimony, the ideal lighting conditions for viewing the turbines, as you used in GWP-2, could be approximately 80 minutes on a clear haze-freeze day. That's not based on any expert opinion or any studying, but basically just your anecdotal observations going to the beach, correct?
No, so that's actually based on, given on the day that I photographed, and this will vary throughout the year. But if you look at the times associated with civil twilight and when sun starts, that's the likely scenario presented in the simulation. So it's where the sun is starting to dip down, and you can tell by the shadows in the simulation because the sun is right down, getting right down close to the horizon, and it's shining. Somebody's probably going to pick up on this, but it's shining under the clouds, and capturing the turbines in full light, and that's a scenario that eventually happen for approximately 80 minutes, give or take 20 minutes per day under clear conditions.
And these would be the 80 minutes right around the time, I guess you said, of sunset, is that correct?
Yeah, the beginning of sunset, to the point where the sun sets behind the horizon. However, the only caveat I put on that is there is a point at which lines will no longer be lighted even during sunset from certain positions. And as you can judge by the shadow cast by the building in my simulation, eventually that shadow will actually creep up along the ocean, and different elements in the landscape will cast shade on the turbines, at which point they would become substantially less visible.
So in other words, you're talking about the period of time in the evening, right before sunset. If you were at the beach, you probably observed people taking their sunset walk. That's the time you're talking about when they'll be most visible, most contrasted, and subject to the special lighting ideal lighting from the sun. Is that correct?
As I stated, that would be roughly the time of day that's represented in the simulation.
All right. And you agree that visual simulations are really just that, for a snapshot in time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would you then agree with the proposition that as far as the Ocean City sunrise, that that in any photograph or any view of the sunrise on a clear day, that the turbines will be visible from the Ocean City shoreline at any time during the sunrise?
Well, I mean, they'll be visible provided the condition is conducive to visibility, which would be under.
Well, my question was, on a clear day, the wind turbines will always be visible from the shoreline at sunrise. Isn't that correct?
I think it depends on the position of the viewer. That's a very important consideration, and it also depends on the position of the sun relative to the turbines.
Well, when you say position of the viewer, the position you've been using is 144th Street. But let's say for North Ocean City to begin with, the viewer in North Ocean City who is on the beach at sunrise on a clear day will always see the wind turbines. Isn't that correct?
Well, again, you're giving me a hypothetical, and there are situations in which, even on a clear day, if the sun is behind the turbines, for example, it depends on the position of the viewer. Because if the sun is behind the turbines, during certain portions of the sunset, you won't see them because you can't look into the sun once it reaches a certain point in the horizon.
Well, the sun will always be behind the turbines because it comes up from the east, correct?
It's not entirely true. Yes, the sun does rise in the east. I'm not disputing that.
Okay.
It's the position of the viewer relative to the turbines during sunrise.
All right, but at sunrise, the time the sun comes from underneath the horizon and goes up few inches, and then goes up into the sky during that hour in the morning, almost always during that period of time on a clear day, the turbines will be visible from the shore. Isn't that right?
Objection, Your Honor. This has been asked and answered a few times now, and it's also not clear how this is related to the difference between the 8 megawatt turbine and the 12 megawatt turbine. I think as Mr. Perkins' simulations have shown, the layouts would be visible, either the 8 megawatt turbine or the 12 megawatt turbine under clear conditions. So I just have a continuing objection to the continued questioning on this point.
Mr. Maloney, this is getting a bit repetitive. We've heard.
This is an important point, and the mayor is going to talk about it too. People come to Ocean City for the sunrise. And what I think his opinion is, although he's wrestling with me a little bit on it, is that on a clear day, you almost always at sunrise are going to see the turbines. We're not going to have any more sunrise photographs in Ocean City without the turbines in it on a clear day. I think that's the question I'm asking. Is there going to be any more on a clear day? Are there going to be any more views of the sunrise where you really won't see the turbines?
Save objection, Your Honor.
I believe we've heard the response of the witness that it depends on numerous occasions so far, but I'll allow the witness to speak for himself and answer that question one final time.
All right, I'll rephrase it. Other than the one scenario you gave us, and only one, about the sun somehow being behind the turbines, isn't it true that on a clear day, at least in North Ocean City, you will always see the turbines at sunrise? That will always be the view going forward. Isn't that true?
I don't mean to beat around the bush here, but the fact of the matter is you can't definitively say always.
Most of the time. Let's say most of the time.
It's fair to say, let me state it this way. There are times when the sunrise will be with the sunrise project, and it will happen frequently. And under clear conditions, they will be visible coincident with the sunrise.
Other than those, all right,
I'll give your answer.
I'll move on. Thank you. Now, at the bottom of page 6 of your rebuttal testimony, you quote from Mr. Sullivan's study, which says, measures such as clustering turbines, arranging them in orderly layouts, using fewer and larger turbines, and using a single turbine design for all turbines in a facility gives the project a sense of more orderly design. But by giving the project a sense of more orderly design, doesn't that impact the visibility of the project?
Can you rephrase the question? I didn't understand.
Well, you talk about the way they measure and order the turbines, that gives the project a more orderly design. But doesn't the orderly design affect both the visibility of the project and the desire of people to look at it?
Well, I think what I'm doing here is the idea that by switching from more smaller turbines to turbines, it's a foundation in visual analysis that can be a method of mitigating visual impacts.
Well, and it mitigates it. Is it your testimony that mitigates it by making it more pleasant to look at as opposed to being less visible?
I don't think we've stated that the turbines would be less visible as a result of the switch from 8 to 12.
So in other words, you're making an aesthetic judgment that it's more orderly for people to look at in its current layout. Is that what you're doing?
No, going back to my testimony, the fact that the 12 megawatt layout, it does tend to, I won't use the term cluster, it tends to concentrate the turbines in a smaller area, and therefore they have less presence on the horizon than if we were using the 16 megawatt layout scenario.
So you're not,
sorry, the 8 megawatt, excuse me.
You're not offering any testimony as the aesthetic value of what they are to look like. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, On page 8 of your rebuttal testimony, you state that during 14% of a given year, visibility does not even extend to 10 miles. But that's not necessarily applicable when talking about wind turbines, is it?
I should mention that I corrected my testimony at the beginning of this hearing, and on page 8, line 19, that should actually be a 20%.
Okay? And with respect to that 20%, are you saying you wouldn't be able to see the wind turbines at all then?
That's correct.
Do you agree that if the layout of the 12 megawatt turbines were moved to a row that is parallel to the coastline, 30 miles from the shore, that the visual impacts of the project from Ocean City would be reduced?
I have not analyzed that scenario, and therefore I cannot make any judgments regarding the rearrangement of the turbines in that configuration.
How about at any location? You can't express an opinion at all as to what whether a parallel row might reduce visual impacts from the shoreline?
Objection, Your Honor. It's outside the scope of Mr. Perkins' testimony.
I'm just asking opinions on it.
He is an expert. We'll allow his opinion on the difference between parallel versus perpendicular.
So again, having not looked at the layout under that scenario, parallel versus perpendicular, I'm reluctant to make any qualifications or judgments about what that might look like.
Do you agree that, quote, turbines will become a visual focal point and will alter the character of the existing view?
Objection, Your Honor. Again, it's outside the scope of the difference between the 8 megawatt and the 12 megawatt turbines.
No, this is a question of Sullivan versus him.
I'll allow the witness to respond.
I think under certain conditions, whether the 8 megawatt or 12 megawatt turbine is chosen, there will be some alteration to the view from Ocean City. However, I think that given the smaller layout associated with the 12 megawatt turbine, that contrast is substantially reduced due to the fact that it takes up less space on the horizon.
Agree on the current layout that the turbines will become a visual focal point.
No, I disagree with that, and that's based on my observations of offshore wind farms. In fact, under clear conditions, at a distance of 22 miles, I made anecdotal conversation with individuals that at a major tourism spot and asked them opinions about the turbines, and they're overwhelmingly the most frequent response I got is what turbines. So I think that in situations where they're viewed at great distances.
What was this?
It was actually in Brighton Point, Point, Newport, Rhode Island. And there were also locations on other locations around Newport, such as the Newport Cliff Walk, and then positions in Narragansett.
The Newport what? The Newport what?
Newport, Rhode Island. The Cliff Walk in Newport, Rhode Island.
Agree that the new layout and the turbines that will be located there will alter the character of the existing.
Under certain conditions, they will serve to minimally change the visual character of the existing view. You know, it's the presence of a form on the horizon that wasn't previous, and as we've shown in the visual simulations, under either layout scenario, the turbines will be visible.
Do you agree with the Sullivan opinion that, quote, the combination of low-angle sunlight, clear atmospheric conditions, and the dull color of the background sky will all contribute to high project visibility?
Repeat that question again.
Do you agree with the Sullivan opinion that, quote, the combination of low-angle sunlight, clear atmospheric conditions, and the dull character of a background sky, those combinations would all contribute to high project visibility?
I generally agree with that statement, with the qualifications that I stated previously, that even during those low angle light scenarios, because of the structures that exist on Ocean City Beach, that low angle of light is often not achievable in Ocean City, because of the shadows cast by those buildings. So that can serve to, at certain points, diminish the effect that Mr. Sullivan is referring to.
Now, were these simulations ever reviewed by any panel of visual professionals, such as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Visual Resources Assessment Procedure?
You're referring to the simulations in my
Yes.
testimony?
Right.
They were not.
That was done by Ørsted for the South Fork Wind Farm, wasn't it?
Objection, Your Honor, going outside the scope again.
Sustained.
Why did you not submit, isn't it the standard to submit these visual depictions to the Visual Resources Assessment Procedure of the Corps?
There's no protocol saying that we're required to submit the simulations to a rating panel. And the purpose of these visual simulations was to allow the commission to see the difference between the 8 and the 12 megawatt turbine.
Well, you did submit them to an independent evaluator, didn't you?
Not these particular simulations associated with my testimony.
So you submitted other depictions of this to an evaluator?
So I believe we're getting into the territory associated with the confidential.
I'm not going to ask you any questions that will take us offline again, but is it fair to say that you submitted those involving the COP, but not these to an evaluator? Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Is there any reason you did not submit these to an evaluator?
Again, the purpose of the visual simulations was to provide the commission with a comparison between the 8 and 12 megawatt turbine.
Why is an evaluator used in your profession? What's the purpose of an independent evaluator?
Typically, evaluations are completed to determine the potential level of visual contrast presented by a project.
Okay. And you don't think this project could have benefited, your analysis could have benefited from this?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. Well, overruled. We'll hear his opinion. Let's hear his opinion.
I'll restate. I think for the purpose of this exercise, an independent evaluator was not necessary, and that the simulations are presented purely so that the commission can do the difference between the 8 and the 12 megawatt turbine.
Mr. Chairman, we have one other subject area, and that's Exhibit 33C. and it's the updated visual impact assessment. And that's been, unfortunately, I don't know that it is confidential, but it's been marked as confidential. And
Mr. Gunderson, is this a confidential exhibit?
Yes, Your Honor. The visual impact assessment is an attachment to the COP, which is confidential under federal review.
Okay.
I would mention, we've mentioned, I guess Ocean City's council has questioned now 2 witnesses on the visual impact assessment and the COP. Those have been filed with the commission in accordance with the 2017 OREC order. Any filings that are made at BOEM are then filed with the commission. So they were filed in the 9431 docket as well as this docket. And I mean, since we've been talking about it, maybe it's easiest to have the commission take judicial notice of those filings and that they are available for this record as well.
Right. I believe the commissioners, we have copies of 33C. Although, Mr. Maloney, I had asked earlier if you were planning to discuss any more confidential documents. At the time, you said no.
no, what I said, I'm going to try to avoid it, but I may have to. I know when somebody's trying to box me in. I'm kidding, Mr. Chairman.
All right, your last line of questioning. So what we're going to have to go offline yet again to take a look at 33C of Ocean City. We're off the record, Mr. Secretary and Amanda, if you could do what we need to do.